Sarah Martinez had been awake for 36 hours straight. The documentary filmmaker rubbed her tired eyes as she settled into Seat 9C of the military transport aircraft. Around her, the massive C-130 Hercules hummed with the low rumble of its 4 turboprop engines. The cargo bay had been fitted with rows of basic military seating, nothing like the comfortable leather seats she was used to on commercial flights. She pulled her worn leather jacket tighter around her shoulders. The temperature inside the aircraft was chilly, and the thin metal walls did little to muffle the engine noise. Sarah had spent the last 3 weeks embedded with a Marine unit in Afghanistan, documenting their humanitarian mission to deliver medical supplies to remote villages. Now she was finally heading home to San Diego, courtesy of a military transport that would make several stops along the way. The loading process had taken 2 hours. Sarah watched as various personnel boarded the aircraft, each group more interesting than the last. There were regular Marines heading home on rotation, a few Air Force technicians, some civilian contractors she couldn't quite place, and then there was the group that immediately caught her attention. 6 men in their 30s, all carrying themselves with the same quiet confidence. They wore standard military uniforms, but something about them was different. They moved with precision, spoke in low voices, and had the kind of alertness that never seemed to switch off. Sarah had filmed enough military documentaries to recognize elite operators when she saw them. These men had the look of Navy SEALs. They took seats scattered throughout the middle section of the aircraft, never sitting directly next to each other, always maintaining visual contact with their teammates. Sarah noticed how they positioned themselves to have clear sight lines to all exits and entrances. Even in this relatively safe environment, their training was evident in every small detail of their behavior. The aircraft commander, a gruff Air Force major, had briefed all passengers on the flight plan. They would make stops in Germany and then the East Coast before finally reaching California. Total flight time would be nearly 18 hours, with layovers for refueling and crew changes. Sarah tried to stay awake for the first few hours, working on her laptop and reviewing footage from her time in Afghanistan. She had captured some powerful interviews with both Marines and Afghan civilians, stories that she knew would resonate with audiences back home. But exhaustion was winning the battle against her determination to stay productive. She noticed that one of the suspected SEALs, a tall man with close-cropped brown hair and intelligent green eyes, kept glancing in her direction. Not in a threatening way, but with the kind of professional assessment that military personnel often gave to unknowns in their vicinity. Sarah was used to this. As one of the few women on military transports, and certainly the only one carrying camera equipment, she often drew curious looks. The man appeared to be in his mid-30s, with the kind of weathered features that came from years of outdoor operations in harsh environments. He had a small scar running through his left eyebrow and hands that looked like they had seen their share of hard work. When their eyes met briefly, he gave her a small professional nod, the kind of acknowledgement that said he had assessed her as a non-threat, but would continue to monitor the situation. As the hours passed, the aircraft settled into the steady rhythm of long-distance flight. The lights were dimmed to help passengers rest, and the constant engine noise created a white noise effect that was surprisingly soothing. Sarah's eyelids grew heavy despite her efforts to stay alert. She thought about her assignment in Afghanistan and the stories she had gathered. There was the Marine sergeant who had organized a soccer game with local children, using a ball that had been deflated and reinflated so many times it barely held its shape. There was the Afghan translator who had risked his life daily to help the American forces, and who still smiled when talking about his young daughter learning to read. There was the village elder who had initially been suspicious of the Americans, but had eventually invited them to share tea and bread in his modest home. These were the stories that mattered, Sarah believed. Not the combat operations and tactical successes that dominated the news, but the human connections that happened in the quiet moments between crises. Her documentaries focused on showing the real people behind the uniforms, both American and foreign, and the complex relationships that formed in war zones. The SEAL with the green eyes had pulled out a book and was reading quietly. Sarah could see it was a biography of Alexander the Great. Interesting choice for a special operations soldier, she thought. It suggested someone who thought deeply about military history and strategy, not just current tactics and technology. Another member of their group, a stocky man with dark skin and laugh lines around his eyes, was working on what appeared to be a crossword puzzle. The contrast between his relaxed demeanor and obvious physical capability was striking. Sarah had learned during her years of military documentaries that special operators often had surprising hobbies and interests outside their professional lives. The aircraft hit a patch of turbulence, causing Sarah's laptop to slide slightly on her tray table. She saved her work and closed the computer, accepting that her body needed rest more than her mind needed productivity. The jet lag from multiple time zone changes was catching up with her, and she could feel her concentration slipping. Sarah reclined her seat as far as the military transport would allow, which wasn't much. She used her jacket as a blanket and her camera bag as a pillow. The combination wasn't particularly comfortable, but she had slept in worse conditions during her documentary work. There had been nights in desert camps, jungle huts, and mountain caves where any flat surface seemed luxurious. As she drifted towards sleep, Sarah was dimly aware of the quiet conversations around her. The SEALs spoke in voices too low for her to make out words, but their tone was calm and professional. Other passengers dozed or read or played cards. The flight crew moved through the cabin occasionally, checking on passengers and monitoring systems. The last thing Sarah remembered before sleep took her was the sound of the aircraft's engines and the gentle vibration of the metal floor beneath her feet. She felt safe despite being thousands of feet above the earth in a military aircraft surrounded by strangers. There was something reassuring about being in the company of such obviously capable and professional military personnel. She had no way of knowing that this peaceful moment was about to be shattered, and that her expertise in recognizing military personnel would become crucial to everyone's survival. The men she had identified as Navy SEALs were indeed among the most elite warriors in the American military, but in a few hours, their skills would be tested in a way none of them had anticipated. The C-130 continued its steady progress across the Atlantic Ocean, carrying its sleeping passengers toward a rendezvous with danger that none of them could have imagined when they boarded the aircraft in Afghanistan. Sarah was deep in sleep when the change happened. It wasn't a sound that woke her, but rather the absence of sound. Her subconscious mind, trained by years of sleeping in unfamiliar places, registered that something was different. The normal background conversations had stopped. The casual movement throughout the cabin had ceased. Even the steady shuffling of cards from a poker game had gone silent. She opened her eyes slowly, keeping her breathing steady and her body still. This was a technique she had learned from a war correspondent mentor years ago. When you wake up in an uncertain situation, gather information before revealing that you're awake. Sarah's position in row 9 gave her a good view of most of the passenger compartment, and what she saw made her fully alert in seconds. Every single one of the Navy SEALs was frozen in place. The man with the green eyes had his book open in his hands, but his attention was focused somewhere else entirely. His muscles were tense, ready for action, though he appeared completely relaxed to casual observation. The stocky man had set down his crossword puzzle and was using the reflection in his watch face to observe something behind him. Sarah followed their collective gaze and felt her heart rate spike. 3 rows behind her, a man she hadn't paid much attention to during boarding was no longer the unremarkable passenger he had appeared to be. He was Middle Eastern, perhaps in his 40s, wearing the same type of civilian contractor clothing that several other passengers had on. But something about him had changed during the flight. The man was awake and alert, despite the dimmed cabin lights. His hands rested on his lap, but Sarah could see tension in his fingers. Most concerning was the small device he held partially concealed in his palm. From her angle, she couldn't make out details, but the way the SEALs were reacting told her everything she needed to know about its potential significance. Sarah realized that the SEALs had likely been watching this passenger from the moment he boarded. Special operations personnel were trained to identify potential threats, and something about this man had triggered their professional instincts. Now, hours into the flight, their suspicions appeared to be justified. The man shifted in his seat, and Sarah caught a glimpse of what looked like wires running from the device to something concealed under his jacket. Her documentary work had taken her to enough conflict zones for her to recognize the components of an improvised explosive device. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This man wasn't just suspicious, he was actively dangerous. The SEAL team leader, a lean man with gray at his temples who sat 3 rows ahead of Sarah, made an almost imperceptible hand signal to his teammates. Sarah had filmed enough military operations to recognize basic tactical communications. The message was clear: potential threat identified, maintain positions, await further instructions. What impressed Sarah was the complete professionalism of their response. No panic, no sudden movements that might trigger a premature reaction from the suspected bomber. They were using their training to assess the situation and develop a response plan, even though they were confined to a narrow aircraft cabin with nowhere to run and limited options for taking action. The device in the man's hand had a small red light that began blinking at regular intervals. Whatever it was, it appeared to be active now. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the aircraft's air conditioning. She was trapped 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean with what appeared to be a suicide bomber and a team of Navy SEALs who were preparing for the most challenging mission of their careers. Sarah's training as a documentary filmmaker had taught her to observe details and think analytically under pressure. She began to take mental notes of everything she could see. The suspected bomber appeared nervous, but determined. He kept checking his watch and looking toward the front of the aircraft where the flight crew was stationed. His breathing was faster than it should be for someone who was simply tired or uncomfortable. The other passengers remained unaware of the developing crisis. A few rows away, 2 Air Force technicians were engaged in a quiet conversation about sports. Several Marines were sleeping soundly. A civilian contractor was typing on his laptop. None of them had the training to recognize the subtle signs that had alerted the SEALs to the danger in their midst. The aircraft hit another patch of turbulence, causing the cabin to shake gently. The suspected bomber gripped his device more tightly, and Sarah saw his thumb move toward what looked like a button or switch. One of the SEALs, a young man with blonde hair and a calm demeanor, began to slowly adjust his position in his seat. He was preparing to move, Sarah realized, planning his approach to neutralize the threat. The team leader made another hand signal, this one telling his men to hold their positions. The timing wasn't right yet. In the confined space of the aircraft cabin, they would have only one chance to act effectively. They needed to wait for the optimal moment when they could move decisively without endangering the other passengers. Sarah felt helpless. She wanted to warn the other passengers to do something to help, but she understood that any sudden movement or noise could trigger exactly the kind of catastrophic response they were all trying to prevent. She forced herself to remain still and appear asleep while her mind raced through the possible scenarios. The bomber reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a cell phone. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized he might be planning to coordinate his attack with ground-based accomplices or to receive a signal from someone else. The implications were terrifying. If this was part of a larger plot, there could be other aircraft at risk or targets on the ground waiting for this plane to be destroyed as a signal to begin other attacks. The SEAL with the green eyes slowly closed his book and set it aside. To any casual observer, it looked like he was simply tired of reading, but Sarah could see the subtle tension in his movements, the way he was positioning himself for action. His teammates were making similar micro-adjustments to their positions, each one moving slightly closer to optimal striking distance while maintaining the appearance of routine passenger behavior. The flight crew seemed unaware of the drama unfolding in the passenger compartment. Sarah could see the loadmaster moving through his normal routine, checking cargo tie-downs and monitoring systems. The pilots were presumably focused on their flight plan and navigation. None of them had the specialized training to recognize the threat that was developing just a few rows from where Sarah lay pretending to sleep. The bomber's phone buzzed softly with an incoming message. He read it quickly, and Sarah saw his expression change from nervous tension to grim resolve. Whatever signal he had been waiting for had apparently arrived. He began to input something on the phone's keypad, his movements deliberate and careful. The SEALs recognized the change in his behavior immediately. The team leader's hand moved almost imperceptibly, giving a signal that Sarah couldn't interpret, but that caused all 6 men to shift their weight forward slightly. They were preparing for immediate action, she realized. The waiting phase was over. Sarah held her breath as she watched the most dangerous game of her life unfold in the cramped confines of a military transport aircraft flying over the dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean. In the next few moments, the lives of everyone aboard would depend on the skill and training of 6 Navy SEALs, who had transformed from sleeping passengers into a lethal fighting force without anyone except Sarah even noticing the transition. The bomber raised the device in his hand, his thumb moving toward what was clearly a detonation trigger. Sarah closed her eyes and prepared for whatever was about to happen, knowing that she was about to witness either a remarkable demonstration of special operations expertise or a tragedy that would make international headlines. What happened next took less than 8 seconds, but Sarah would remember every detail for the rest of her life. The moment the bomber's thumb began to move toward the trigger, the Navy SEALs exploded into coordinated action with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. The team leader rose from his seat in a fluid motion, covering the distance to the bomber in 3 swift strides. At the same moment, the blonde SEAL moved from the opposite direction, while the stocky man with the crossword puzzle approached from behind. The other 3 SEALs positioned themselves to control the rest of the passenger compartment and block any potential escape routes. The bomber never had a chance to complete his intended action. The team leader's hand clamped down on the man's wrist with devastating force, instantly immobilizing the hand holding the detonation device. The blonde SEAL simultaneously secured the bomber's other arm, while the third operator checked him for additional weapons or explosive devices. "Federal agents," the team leader announced in a clear, authoritative voice that carried throughout the cabin. "Everyone remain in your seats and keep your hands visible." Sarah watched in amazement as the other passengers reacted with remarkable calm. The Marines immediately understood they were witnessing a counter-terrorism operation and remained motionless. The Air Force personnel and civilian contractors followed the SEALs' instructions without question. The years of military training and discipline among the passengers had just saved dozens of lives by preventing panic that could have interfered with the operation. The device in the bomber's hand was carefully extracted and examined by one of the SEALs who appeared to have explosive ordnance training. Sarah could see him studying the wiring and components with practiced expertise. After a tense 30 seconds, he nodded to his team leader and began the delicate process of rendering the device safe. "Sir," one of the SEALs called to the team leader, "we have a vest." The bomber was wearing a suicide vest under his jacket, just as Sarah had suspected. The discovery sent a chill through the cabin, but the SEALs handled it with the same professional calm they had shown throughout the operation. 2 of them worked together to carefully remove the vest, while the others maintained security and monitored the other passengers for any signs of additional threats. The bomber himself had gone completely passive once he realized his mission had failed. He wasn't speaking, but Sarah could see the defeat in his eyes. Whatever cause he had been willing to die for, he now knew that his sacrifice would accomplish nothing. The SEALs had prevented him from harming anyone, and his carefully planned attack had been neutralized by 6 men who had recognized the threat before he even knew he was being watched. The team leader moved toward the front of the aircraft to communicate with the flight crew. Sarah could hear parts of his conversation with the aircraft commander, though the specific details were muffled by engine noise and the distance. She caught phrases like threat neutralized, divert to Ramstein, and explosive device secured. Within minutes, Sarah felt the aircraft banking into a turn. The pilots were changing course, heading for the nearest safe airport where law enforcement and bomb disposal experts would be waiting. The 3-hour diversion to Ramstein Air Base in Germany would delay everyone's journey home, but it had just saved their lives. One of the SEALs, the man with the green eyes who had been reading about Alexander the Great, approached Sarah's row. She realized that her pretense of being asleep was no longer necessary or convincing. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I noticed you were awake during the incident. Are you injured or in any distress?" Sarah sat up properly and shook her head. "I'm fine. That was incredible work." The SEAL studied her with those intelligent green eyes. "You're the documentary filmmaker, aren't you? I saw your press credentials when you boarded." "Sarah Martinez," she confirmed. "I've been embedded with military units before, but I've never seen anything like what just happened." "We'd appreciate it if you could keep the operational details confidential for now," he said. "There may be additional aspects to this threat that we're not aware of yet." Sarah nodded. She understood the security implications. If this had been part of a larger plot, revealing how the SEALs had detected and neutralized the bomber could compromise future operations or endanger other lives. The remainder of the flight to Ramstein was surreal. The bomber sat quietly under guard, the explosive devices had been secured, and the other passengers gradually began to process what had just happened. Conversations were muted and respectful. Everyone understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The Air Force technicians who had been discussing sports were now talking quietly about the tactics they had observed. The civilian contractors seemed stunned by how quickly the situation had been resolved. The Marines, true to their training, had remained alert and ready to assist throughout the entire incident. Sarah found herself thinking about the story she had just lived through. This wasn't something she had filmed or documented from the outside. She had been an unwitting participant in a real-life thriller that most people would never believe if they hadn't seen it themselves. The question was whether she would ever be allowed to tell this story, and whether anyone would believe her if she did. When they landed at Ramstein, the aircraft was immediately surrounded by security personnel, German police, American military police, and what appeared to be counter-terrorism specialists boarded the plane within minutes. The bomber was removed first, followed by the explosive devices. The SEALs provided detailed briefings to the investigating officers, their professional reports as precise as their tactical action had been. Sarah and the other passengers were interviewed individually about what they had observed. She was honest about her awareness of the situation, but careful to focus on what she had seen rather than speculating about tactical details or intelligence implications. The interviews took several hours. By the time they were complete, a replacement aircraft had been arranged to continue their journey to the United States. The original flight crew would remain in Germany for additional debriefing, while a fresh crew would take the passengers home. As they waited in the terminal for their new flight, Sarah had a chance to speak with the SEAL team leader. She learned that his name was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson, and that he had been leading special operations teams for over 12 years. "How did you know?" Sarah asked. "What made you suspicious of him from the beginning?" Thompson considered his answer carefully. "Multiple small indicators. His behavior during boarding didn't match his supposed background. His body language suggested military training that didn't fit with his cover identity. He positioned himself in a seat that would maximize casualties in an explosion. When you've seen enough threats, you develop an instinct for recognizing them." The whole team saw it? We brief each other on potential concerns. When one of us identifies a possible threat, we all start watching. Today, our caution paid off. Sarah thought about the implications. How often does this happen? Threats on military transports? More often than the public knows, less often than the media might suggest, Thompson replied diplomatically. What matters is that we're prepared when it does happen. The new flight to the United States was uneventful, though Sarah noticed that security was visibly increased. The SEALs remained alert but relaxed, having successfully completed the most unusual mission of their current deployment. The other passengers seemed grateful to be alive and eager to get home to their families. Sarah spent the remaining flight time thinking about the story she had witnessed. She had seen ordinary military personnel reveal themselves to be extraordinary warriors when circumstances demanded it. She had watched training and instinct combine to prevent what could have been a catastrophic terrorist attack. Most importantly, she had learned something about the quiet professionals who protect others without expecting recognition or praise. When they finally landed in San Diego, Sarah gathered her equipment and prepared to return to her normal life. The SEALs disappeared into the crowd with characteristic efficiency, blending back into anonymity as easily as they had emerged from it to save lives. 6 months later, Sarah would receive permission to tell a version of this story, with certain details changed to protect operational security. Her documentary, Guardian Angels, Special Operations Personnel in Civilian Settings, would win several awards and help the public understand the hidden sacrifices made by elite military units. But she would never forget the moment when 6 men transformed from sleeping passengers into a lethal fighting force in the time it took her to open her eyes. She had been napping in row 9 when the Navy SEALs around her suddenly stopped cold. And in that moment, they had saved every life on that aircraft through pure professional excellence and courage.